The science is clear. Collagen is the most abundant protein in your body, essential for healthy skin, joints, bones, and even gut health. But starting in our mid 20s, our collagen production begins to decline. And by age 40, most people have lost significant collagen, leading to wrinkles, joint discomfort, and slower recovery. That's why I'm excited to announce the latest product I formulated for my supplement line, Adapt Naturals. BioAvail Collagen Plus contains Solugel certified grass-fed collagen peptides, with the only truly certified grass-fed collagen ingredient on the market. Unlike competitors who make unverified grass-fed claims, our collagen is certified by LIAF Control in collaboration with the American Grass-Fed Association. BioAvail Collagen Plus contains low molecular weight peptides in the 2 kilodalton range, making it more bioavailable, easier to digest, and dissolve completely clear in liquids. Each serving delivers the research-backed dose of 10 grams of collagen peptides to support skin elasticity, joint comfort, muscle recovery, and gut health. Visit adaptnaturals.com to learn more about BioAvail Collagen Plus and take a proactive step toward looking and feeling your best at any age. Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you follow my work for any length of time, you'll know I've been a vocal critic of the U.S. dietary guidelines and the food scales, the food rating scales that have gone into those guidelines. They are reductionist. They focus too much on the quantity of isolated nutrients and not enough on the overall quality of the diet. And this leads to some absurd ratings like candy being more healthful than red meat or eggs because of the cholesterol and saturated fat content of those foods. Back in February of this year, 2025, I saw a paper published by Frederic Leroy and Ty Beal, who's been on the show a couple of times. I've been aware of both of their work for some time, and they published an alternative framework called the Nourishment Table that basically has two primary factors for determining dietary adequacy. One is nutrient density, and one is food processing. And as you'll see in this conversation, that simple framework is a powerful way of getting us to where we want to be in terms of the foods that we should be consuming. And so I invited Frederic to be on the show. I'd been aware of his work, like I said, for many years, but we'd never connected personally. So it was really a pleasure to meet him and discuss the Nourishment Table. He's very active in this space. He has a PhD in applied biological science, and he is a professor in food science and biotechnology. He's president of the education board and teaches nutrition, sustainable agri-food systems, food chemistry, food technology. I know of his work because he's been a huge advocate for regenerative agriculture and the important role that animal foods play in the human diet. So we cover a wide range of topics in this conversation. We talk about the need for the Nourishment Table as a new framework for assessing adequate nutrition. We talk about nutrient density and the animal to plant ratio, the role of food processing, both the pros and cons. Like processing isn't always bad. We have fermentation, sprouting that actually increases nutrient value versus the type of processing that we see in foods that are in a bag or a box. We talk about some policy issues and the challenges of changing the dietary guidelines and just some practical tips for how to eat more nourishing food. So I really enjoyed this conversation. I think you will too. Let's dive in. Frederic, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to finally meet you after all this time.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Chris. I've been following you since a long time, and it's nice to have this conversation now.
Great. So I just want to dive right into the Nourishment Table. This is something I was so excited about when I saw it published because, as you know, I've been a vocal critic of the typical nutrient scales that have been used in studies like Eat Lancet and many others that often lead to these ridiculous findings where candy is ranked as more healthful than red meat or cholesterol, which I think most people with common sense would would disagree with, but I think many people don't realize that these are the scales that have been informing dietary guidelines and nutrition research for many years. So why don't we just start with what led to the development of the Nourishment Table for you? What problems did you and your co-authors set out to solve,
Hmm.
and why did you feel this was just so important right now?
Well, exactly this. I think the fact that a lot of the policies we're seeing in the nutrition space are based on very reductionist approaches to food. You know very well, and I guess most of your listeners will also know that we're facing a huge public health crisis with part of the global population overeating, another part undereating. We have about, what is it, one up to 2 billion people, I think, either overweight or obese, and then we have almost a billion that is chronically underfed. Combine that also with the micronutrient deficiencies and the fact that we don't see improvement. Right? So part of that is economic, but I think part of it is also the fact that the policies are not based on the best possible scenarios. And so we wanted to do something about it. And I kind of brought a team together with different people with different expertises. So we combine all sorts of different disciplines to look at this problem. And the intention was to brush away all the conventional elements of the guidelines that we think are not good enough because they're based on low certainty evidence and because they're maybe too narrow or too specific, and just maintain the common sense framework that would be more productive and also emphasize flexibility, because I think a lot of what we're seeing is very patronizing. It's very much steering us towards specific models that have been designed in by specific people in specific regions, and especially Lancet is coming up with a planetary health model that they wish to impose on the entire global population. So we wanted to emphasize flexibility and just kind of find the boundaries in which you can build and construct proper human diets.
That's one of the things I love most about the Nourishment Table is the simplicity and the elegance of the framework. You have basically two components: nutrient density and the amount of food processing. Why did you choose those two as the most critical components of the scale?
For a number of reasons. The first one is, of course, that both are very hot topics in the current nutrition debate. So there's a lot of talk on processing and ultra processing. The NOVA scheme is often mentioned. So that's one of the very topical conversations. And the other one is the nutrient density axis we're incorporating in the model. And that is largely correlating with the animal plant ratio, just for the simple fact that animals are at a higher trophic level. So they tend to be more animal foods tend to be more nutrient dense. Now, that's not a perfect correlation. Of course, you have plant foods that are also nutrient dense, and you have animal foods or especially processed variants that are not so nutrient dense. But it tends to match that animal plant ratio to a certain degree, and that's another big debate right now. So it's the combination of both. Also, if you think of it, it's those two elements of the human diet are probably the two factors that mostly contributed to our evolutionary divergence from other primates. It's a fact that we started to eat higher up the food chain and more nutrient dense foods, combined with the technology that we've been developing since a few millions of years.
Right, cooking, fermentation,
Right. Yes.
etc.
Yes. Yes.
I've had Ty Beal, who I know you know and respect, on the show a couple of times, and we talked about his nutrient density scales from his studies that actually took bioavailability into account, which had not been previously done. And I've shared the scale with organ meats often coming out on top, quite far above even muscle meats in terms of nutrient density in animal foods, and then shellfish scoring really highly as well. But what I love about this, I think both of these factors too, and you kind of alluded to it before, is when you think about it from a behavioral perspective, these are two variables that people can pretty easily modulate in their diet. How processed is the food? Well, that's fairly straightforward. Is it something that's in a bag or a box and has an ingredient list that's 2 miles long and full of things, words that you can't pronounce? Then that's probably, very highly processed. If it looks like it came out of the ground with minimal intervention, pretty low process. So it's fairly easy to, without any scientific training or background or any understanding of the more complex nuances, to change what you're doing there, right? And then you can also, I think, once you understand some basic principles, which we're going to talk about, fairly easily modulate your nutrient density just by choosing, as you mentioned, more animal foods in your diet, at least for certain nutrients. We know that leafy green vegetables, for example, kale, some of the brassicas, et cetera, score pretty highly on the nutrient density scale for certain nutrients that aren't found in plant foods. But in general, as you said, if you increase the proportion of calories that you're getting from animal foods, you will typically improve your nutrient density. So I love the simplicity there. Let's talk a little bit about the flip side of that, like this nutritionism and this kind of myopic focus on isolated nutrients or single environmental or metrics. Like, how has that led us down the wrong path?
Well, I think Skrinis has, written about this extensively, made some great arguments. Nutritionism will typically overlook diversity, and that means inter-individual diversity. So people have different needs to begin with. Not everybody is the same. So metabolic needs can vary quite a bit between different people. And nutritionism tends to ignore that by standardizing, the portions and the proportions of the various nutrients. And by doing so, it kind of negates the tremendous potential we have for self-selecting proper foods. That's sometimes underestimated. It's amazing how much accuracy there is in the way we can navigate, that diversity of foods and find the proper foods, as long as those foods are wholesome. As long as we don't get tricked into the ultra processed diets. And then also it kind of ignores the synergies and the food matrix and the plethora of compounds we don't even begin understanding what they actually mean for our health. So there's a lot of, think of plant secondary components in plants. We have all sorts of effects, and we can hardly understand what they're doing because the complexity is so enormous. And if you throw out all that complexity, well, you end up with the Kellogg's cornflakes approach. You just have your macronutrients, and you fortify it with the micronutrients, and then you just assume that this is going to be a proper diet. Well, it doesn't seem to work quite well. So I think it's a major problem. It's pervasive. It's pervasive in policy. It's even pervasive in the environmental domain, where when people develop environmental metrics, they kind of just bring in nutrition by using very reductionist approaches to what calories or maybe protein in the best case, but very, very narrow views on what the true complexity of food means for human beings.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think it also distorts the nutritional research paradigm and the kind of studies that are published. I mean, how many studies have we seen about how eating dark chocolate will increase your lifespan or decrease your lifespan, or eating blueberries will increase your lifespan?
Right.
Again, I think most people with common sense understand that just eating blueberries is not going to increase their lifespan by 12% or 15% or whatever. But that's the absurdity of what happens when you have this kind of reductionist approach that focuses on single nutrients. Let's get back to talking about nutrient density. Your February 2025 paper in Animal Frontiers suggested that nutrient density improves once animal source calories reach between 25 and 33% of the diet, I believe was the threshold. How did you arrive at that threshold? And then, what kind of variability do we see across cultures and different ages? Is there a sex difference between men and women? What's the variability there?
Yeah, so the value is we kind of bumped onto that value from a number of angles. So it's kind of a convergence of different lines of thought. You mentioned Ty Beal. So Ty is one of the co-authors of the paper, and so Ty has looked at the Lancet report specifically, and so they found out that the Lancet report brings in about 14% of the calories from animal source foods, and that creates deficiencies in certain micronutrients. If you don't fortify, of course, I mean, you could always supplement or fortify, but if you don't, then you have those inherent deficiencies, which have to do with the bioavailability as well. That was overlooked by the Lancet authors to a large degree, and they then calculated what you would need to have to cover those nutritional needs of at least of the priority nutrients. The priority nutrients would be covered by about 28%, if I remember well, of animal source foods in the caloric budget. Right? Then you would actually have to double the amount. And then there's also another study from GAIN. Stella Nordhagen was the first author, and so that's GAIN is the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. Thai is part of that same organization.
The NGO that ties, yeah, right.
So what they did is looking at national diets, and they've plotted them versus the animal plant ratios as well, and then you see that for all those diets worldwide, that once you go below that threshold of about 30%, then you see all sorts of micronutrient deficiencies pop up again. So there's this angle, and then there's another more evolutionary perspective. And so we have Neil Mann as another co-author, and Neil is emeritus professor from Australia, and he's an evolutionary nutritionist to a certain degree at least. And Neil has worked with people like Lauren Cordain, and they have looked at evolutionary diets, or ancestral diets to be more specific, because they mostly looked at modern hunter-gatherers. And in the modern hunter-gatherer spectrum, you see that there is a very wide variability in the amount of, in the percentage of animal foods on that same caloric intake. And it ranges somewhere between 25-30% and almost completely animal-based, so about, let's say, up to 95%. And that is, of course, in the modern hunter-gatherer, based on modern hunter-gatherer data. Then, of course, you have also the Ice Age stage, where people were probably towards the upper end. In the warmer climate zones, they are more or less around 50%. Some go a bit below that, but there seems to be an ancestral spectrum that is kind of matching our evolutionary requirements, and it doesn't drop below a certain percentage of animal foods. Now, that is, of course, in an ancestral context where you didn't have the fortification, you didn't have the supplementation, and it was virtually impossible to go down that spectrum further. We can do so today. You know, it's at least technically feasible, but it wasn't from an evolutionary perspective. So it's interestingly more or less the same percentage. So I don't want to set this number in stone either. You know, it's not exactly 25% or 30%, and it depends a lot on the quality of the foods, obviously. Interestingly enough, the current intake of animal foods in the American diet is about 30%. Right? And still we have deficiencies. And that's, of course, because the plant part of it is based on starches and sugars and oils. Right? So you of course, if you're going to reduce your intake, you would have to take care that the plants you're bringing in are sufficiently nutrient dense.
I wonder if part of it too is the quality of the type of meats consumed. For example, on the nutrient scale in Ty's paper, chicken, which is a very popular meat in the United States because of all of the hate on red meat that persisted for so many years, is one of the least nutrient dense meats that you can eat compared to red meat, and especially compared to organ meats, which have completely fallen out of favor in the American diet. Do you think that has something to do with it? That, you know, our ancestors, even not too far back in the US, perhaps my grandparents were eating nose to tail. They were eating organ meats. They were eating more gelatinous cuts of meat, high in glycine. They were consuming primarily probably beef and other ruminant animals. You know, chicken was something that people had on Sunday dinner, right? Because, you know, you kill a cow, you can feed your family for a long time. You kill a chicken, you can maybe feed your family for one meal. Like most people haven't actually eaten a truly pasture raised chicken. They're scrawny and small. There's not a lot of meat there. So do you think that has something to do with it? And maybe we could use this as a segue to talking about the role of organ meats and shellfish and foods like that in terms of their impact on nutrient density.
Yeah, definitely. There's a very big difference between eating, deep fried chicken nuggets and the ancestral types of meat and organ meat. Yes, was very clearly part of the dietary intake. It must have been extremely important to have. So people were not wasting it. It was good nutrition. It was valued. It was part of. I'm talking from a European perspective, which I'm most familiar with. But organ meats were very much part of the, and are still very much part of the gastronomic legacy. The culinary legacies we're having in traditional recipes. Um, More in some regions than others, but still, they're so nutrient dense that they can make a big difference even with small amounts.
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely apparent when you look at those scales. And this is not to criticize the nutrient density of muscle meat and red meat, but like liver, for example, is several times more nutrient dense according to the scale. Beef liver is several times more nutrient dense than beef muscle meat. I think people often don't understand the magnitude of the difference there. I think, if I recall off the top of my head, on Ty's scale, you had to eat only 11 calories of liver to
Right. Yeah.
get one third of the sufficiency of all of the nutrients that were studied in that scale, and then red meat is somewhere a few hundred calories or something like that. So it's a meaningful difference. And my audience has heard me talk about this ad nauseum, so we don't need to belabor the point. But what are some other nutrients of concern that you start to see inadequate intake of when animal protein drops below that threshold?
Well, actually, there are quite a number of them, and again, it will depend on how much you build in quality in the plant side of the diet. But typically, you have the ones like iron and zinc and B12 and vitamin A and choline as well is very much underestimated. What is it in the States? It's about 80 to 90% of people that are consuming below the recommendations, and we don't even know what the proper recommendations are supposed to be because
Right.
its deficiency is very hard to diagnose, right? It's the clinical deficiencies it's a minority of people. It's a very low percentage, but the impact of choline deficiency is maybe very much underestimated. It's a very important nutrient for brain health, especially at young age or during pregnancy. So the impact of that, we don't even know what that means, but that's one of them. And then, but you also see,
EPA and DHA,
yeah,
the long
exactly,
chain
yeah,
omega 3
yeah,
fats.
yeah. And then there's a lot of stuff in there that again they may not be essential nutrients in the classical sense of the word, but they contribute to health as well. Things like creatine or carnitine or carnosine, they also are part of the larger picture. And again, if you're very reductionist, you just don't take those into account, but they do have their function.
Yeah, I like that there are now some studies coming out that are looking at, like, for example, the differences in nutrient content of pasture raised meat versus conventional meat. If you look at some of the essential nutrients, there's not much of a difference. But if you expand the range of nutrients that you're looking at to include some of the ones that you mentioned and then some of the lesser known nutrients, there's quite a big difference there. And to your point, we don't even fully understand the impact of that yet. We're just beginning to be able to measure all of those nutrients and then determine what their impact is.
And there's something. I'm sorry that I interrupt you, but
Go
there's
ahead,
something else
please.
that is also fascinating me is that, and that's the difference between, you mentioned chicken before, but you have this pasture raised chicken and you have industrial chicken, and if you eat a small piece of pasture raised chicken, it may be a perception, and don't have full scientific proof behind it, but my impression is that the satiety value of that meat may also be higher than of the industrial variant, just maybe because of all the phytochemicals that are inside. and the way this signals something within the body. So that's another area that we have hardly explored. That Fred Provenza talks about this a bit in his work, but and Stefan van Vliet as well. So those things are also fascinating. So what would be the difference between a complex matrix like a traditionally raised animal versus an industrial animal that has just where the focus is really on hypertrophy and muscle rather than the actual composition of the tissue?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And Stefan van Vliet has been on the show as well. And we talked about the phytonutrient content of pasture raised meat and some of the recent research he's doing there, which is really fascinating. On that note, in plant-based diet advocates and even just the sort of more conventional way of looking at diet talks a lot about the importance of things like fiber that you of course get more of from plant foods than animal foods, and phytochemicals, phytonutrients, and then concepts like glycemic load. As you put together this framework, how did you think about those variables? And since you did not include them, I'm assuming they're included indirectly.
Yes.
In the sense that
Yes.
you eat less processed food, but you didn't choose to include them as sort of direct variables that people are manipulating. So what was your thought process there, and how important do you think those factors are for the average person to think about?
Well, it's you automatically land on that composition of foods, on that composition of diets if you take into account the principles of the table. So if you exclude the ultra processed foods, as you say, you end up with the moderately processed or minimally processed foods, and then and you also kind of, if you put the focus on the more nutrient dense plants, you will end up with higher proportions of certain micronutrients that are more difficult to source from animal foods, magnesium and potassium and folic acid. Maybe if you don't have your occasional liver on your plate, so you end up in that space, and fiber will be part of it. So there's a big difference, I think, if you focus on wholesome foods and the fiber intake you will have from those foods versus the ultra processed foods, where you have in many cases artificially added fiber, just again because it scores well on all the algorithms and Nutri-Scores and you name it. But in that case, I think fiber is often to be seen as a proxy for wholesome foods rather than as the thing to focus on. So when they're constructing these dietary scores and making those dietary evaluations, and they put such an emphasis on fiber, well, that's fiber is a good thing, but it's also a powerful proxy for wholesome foods, unless that fiber is artificially added to the composition, and then it doesn't mean much. So that's why we didn't include fiber as such as a focus point, because it depends on which type of fiber we're talking about. And there's so many different molecular structures behind fiber with their own different functionalities. So it can, even from a biochemical perspective, it's difficult to group it into one single family.
Yeah, that makes sense. And again, it goes back to the simplicity, the value of simplicity there. When you just focus on these two variables, that not everything naturally falls into place, and you reduce confusion, probably improve compliance, and that's important with something like this. What about dairy? So it seems challenging in some ways because we know that it's a nutrient dense food, especially full fat dairy. And I've written a lot about the fact that there's really no evidence to support non-fat and low-fat dairy recommendations. There was just a new paper published on this recently. I'm not sure if you saw it, corroborating that. But it's a great source of calcium, certain fatty acids that are hard to get elsewhere. It's a nourishing food. And yet we also know that lactose intolerance is very common worldwide, particularly in Asia and West Africa, other parts of Africa. How do we think about dairy from the perspective of this scale and nutrient sufficiency, particularly calcium?
Certainly, if you tolerate dairy, then it's a very nourishing food. The full fat version obviously is even better, because the fat fraction as such contains interesting compounds. Just things like vitamin K2 and then even the fatty acids inside also have their own biological functions. So it's full fat dairy is extremely nourishing. You of course need to tolerate it. People have sometimes lactose intolerance. That's a lot of people. That's the majority on the planet. But however, you can also develop dairy products where you deplete the lactose. Like if you take the aged cheeses, for instance, the fermentation actually depleted the lactose. And even people with lactose intolerance, they can tolerate small portions. Now, of course, there are other things playing as well. It's not only the lactose; it could be other kind of reactions, and it may not be suitable for everyone. But people that have no issue with dairy, I think it's a great option, especially the yogurts, and which are also very nice foods and convenient foods.
That reflects my view as well. And it's interesting, even that there's some studies suggesting that if you consume yogurt or kefir, you can actually reduce lactose intolerance over
Yeah, that's an
time.
official claim in the European Union, if I'm not mistaken. So the lactase from the bacteria is brought in helps the digestion of lactose. Yes.
Right. And there may even be some horizontal gene transfer, that helps kind of train your gut microflora on how to digest lactose over time. So very interesting. Collagen isn't just about beauty. It's the structural protein that literally holds your body together. It makes up about 30% of all the protein in your body, supporting everything from your skin and joints to your gut lining and blood vessels. That's why I'm thrilled to announce the latest product I formulated for my supplement line, Adapt Naturals. BioAvail Collagen Plus is a premium collagen supplement that stands apart in three crucial ways. First, it contains the only truly certified grass-fed collagen ingredient on the market. While most brands make unverified grass-fed claims, our Solugel collagen peptides are certified by LIAF Control in collaboration with the American Grass-Fed Association. This certification guarantees our collagen comes from cattle raised outdoors on pasture 365 days per year without hormones, antibiotics, or steroids. It also ensures the animals are born and raised on family farms and ranches rather than big multinational corporate operations. Second, it has an optimal molecular weight of 2 kilodaltons, which is critical for absorption. This low molecular weight means it dissolves completely clearly in liquids, is rapidly absorbed, and is gentle on your digestive system, avoiding the bloating some people experience with other collagen supplements. Third, each serving delivers the full 10-gram dose shown in clinical studies to deliver real results, from improved skin elasticity and reduced wrinkles to better joint comfort and faster exercise recovery. And unlike other supplements that contain fillers or additives, BioAvail Collagen Plus contains just one clean ingredient, certified grass-fed collagen peptides, nothing else. Visit adaptnaturals.com to learn more about BioAvail Collagen Plus and experience the difference that truly pure, optimally formulated collagen can make for your skin, joints, and overall health. Okay, so let's move on to food processing, this portion of the scale, since we've just largely been talking about nutrient density, starting with the NOVA system, which is the system that we hear a lot about as a means of measuring the degree of food processing. But you've criticized it as being too blunt, maybe kind of a sledgehammer where we need a more precise tool. So what are the problems with NOVA? What are the biggest blind spots? And how does Nourishment Table improve on that?
Well, to be fair, I'm not the most harsh critic out there. I'm actually quite favorable in a way that Nova has opened up the discussion and has been very productive. And it's not a perfect system. That's the problem. It's not, but it's very hard to come up with a perfect system anyway. Whenever we as humans try to put things in boxes, we always kind of have things that fall in between or in the gray zones. So we don't cover foods to perfection with the Nova system. However, what I think is often misunderstood is that uh, Nova is not a system that is against processing. Well, on the contrary, it actually makes the point that processing is useful, but there are certain types of processing that are harmful. And in its definition, if you look at the broader definition, you see that it's not just a matter of intensity of processing only. It also has this qualitative definition where they say, it's those kind of branded products that are designed to be addictive. They are pushed by big multinationals. They are generally deconstructed food ingredients that are put together once more in a concoction that is then, colored and flavored and emulsified. And that actually makes quite a bit of sense. And I think the problem with Nova is when you try to apply it, and that's maybe where you picked up my criticism, when you try to apply it to single foods. And because you will always have that difficulty, how many ingredients would you tolerate, right? Is it 5, 6? How many can we accept? Are they all problematic to begin with? I think you have to take Nova to the dietary pattern level, and that's what we do in the paper as well. We don't judge foods on their Nova classification as such. What we do is advise people to steer away from diets that are dominated by Nova 4, because then I think it becomes much more robust. Then you get rid of all those intricate differences and little complexities, and you just have the common sense approach that you just try to stay away from the hyper engineered foods that are addictive and create problems. And whether you do that through Nova or any other qualification is besides the point. I think it's the common sense part that is most valuable here, and there are certain criteria that we need to fulfill, and Nova kind of does that. But this maybe we need to have a deeper discussion or at the academic level to solve all those things. But at the more superficial level, when it comes to explaining people what to eat or not to eat, I think it's good enough.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. And then, of course, there's also the fact that certain forms of processing, which I think most people wouldn't even think of as processing in the sense that we talk about in Nova, but fermentation, sprouting, nixtamalization of corn, particularly, or masa, these actually increase nutrient bioavailability typically, and are going to maybe even make the foods have a higher ranking on the nourishment table score.
Yeah, and that's especially valid in the lower animal percentage part of the table. So if you go all the way to the left side of that table, you end up in that space that is less robust. Actually, we have, if you look at the table we constructed, you have the upper layer, and that's the ultra processed diets, and there we put like a red color, something you don't enter. You stay away from ultra processed diets. And then the left side is more orange, right? We're not saying you cannot go there. If you're a vegetarian or even if you're vegan, there are solutions. It's just that it's more tricky because you're moving out of that biological robust spectrum that we have encoded in our physiology, and you're entering a more experimental zone. It is feasible, but you need to be careful. And if you're going to enter it, then processing is a good thing, because processing will help you detoxify certain toxic components you'll find in plants. That's what we've been doing that since always. It will help you increase the digestibility of plant foods. It will also help you to improve bioavailability of certain micronutrients. So processing as such is something that is especially valuable for plant foods, even more than for animal foods. I mean, it also helps you to digest meat. If you eat raw meat, it's it's not kind of the optimal way to eat it, but it's not even enjoyable, I think, except for carpaccio. People actually roast meat or heat it or whatever. But for plants, it holds a particular potential because it always has been essential for humans. There's something called it's called McHenry's megadoncio ratio or something like that, and that has been used to look at how much an animal can cope with unprocessed plant materials, right? And we see that for humans, that ratio has moved along the spectrum quite a bit, starting from Homo habilis all the way to sapiens. And it shows that based on that ratio, it shows that we actually again depend on animal foods because we wouldn't make it with only plants. And Homo sapiens was only able to go beyond that limit or that boundary by processing. And especially during the Mesolithic, during the broad spectrum revolution, humans started to, so when the climate changed again and the megafauna died out, humans started to use the diversity of plants that appeared with the new climate under the new climatic conditions, and started to process, to find all sorts of different ways to process those foods as a kind of warm up for the Neolithic, and experiment with different processing techniques. So it always has been there, and it has been extremely useful in the past, and it remains so today.
I find it fascinating that human beings figured this out. Like, it goes back to what you were saying before, is how little we in the modern world trust our own intuitive sense and our own cravings and our just our response to food. But these cultures figured out, without the benefit of modern science, that just eating legumes, for example, that are cooked without any processing beforehand is not a good idea. And so you look at traditional cultures, they always soak and sometimes even sprout legumes before they consume them. And same thing with grains. Everyone from like oatmeal in the Scottish Highlands traditionally was soaked and prepared with some kind of acid medium. You see this all over the world, and yet today that has largely been lost. Like in the modern world, so much of the grain that's consumed is not, first of all, it's not even whole grain to begin with anymore, and it's certainly not fermented or sprouted when it's consumed in processed flour form in most cases. But at least in health food stores, you can see this trend starting to reverse a little bit. You can go into like Whole Foods and buy almonds that are sprouted almonds, for example. You can buy sprouted quinoa and things like this. So it seems like, at least in a subset of the population, there's some increased awareness of the importance of that, which is good. Let's talk about fake meat and where fake meat fails on the nourishment table scale. Is it primarily nutrient density, or is it processing, or is it both in the case of these products?
Yeah, I think we need a distinction between what they call cultured meat or lab meat and plant-based imitation meat. Right? Those are two very different things. The
Yeah.
plant-based imitation foods are, in many cases, if not most cases, ultra-processed foods. Right, so they are highly processed. You see it also with non-meats, other animal foods. You have, for instance, imitation eggs or imitation shrimp or anything you want. They have a plant-based imitation. Dairy, of course, very often as well. So many of those are indeed ultra-processed. And if you look at the composition of, and I think it depends a bit also if you talk about dairy imitations or meat imitations, they're not processed to the same degrees, but the meat imitations are usually a protein isolate with refined fat or oil, and then a lot of emulsifiers and things to structure and texturize it, colorants and flavors. And because if you start from a protein isolate, it is rather impalatable, right? It's not something that is nice to eat. So you need a lot of tricks from the toolbox of food engineers to be able to make it look and taste like meat. And so that implies that, again, the entire focus here is usually on the protein. And some of them may have added micronutrients, but it's very narrowly seen as a protein replacer. And by doing so, you kind of ignore all the other nutrients that you will have in meat. So it's reducing it to a more narrow nutritional spectrum. And then the cosmetic interventions you need to make it look like meat, they come with all those ingredients. Now, is that problematic? Well, we don't really know for sure, but there are a lot of indications nowadays that especially emulsifiers and those kind of components are potentially having impact on the gut microbiome and start to emulsify on places where you actually don't want them to emulsify. And they may have their impact over longer timescales and through mechanisms that are not so easy to pick up based on diagnosis, because they're more at the chronic level. So it's something that is, I wouldn't recommend it. I also think it's a very impoverished way to look at diets. If you don't want to eat meat, fair enough. I mean, there are solutions to avoid meat. You can be lacto-ovo vegetarian, or you can even be vegan and come up with whole food solutions. It's basing your whole dietary philosophy on an imitation of a food you actually don't want to eat. I don't find that a good foundation for dietary scenarios and the dietary future of our species.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting just from a purely economic standpoint. You look at the trajectory of these companies over time and also their share of shelf space, and you can see that it's a failing enterprise at this point. And people have not bought into it. It's the truth of the matter. So I think our basic human sensibilities prevailed in this case, fortunately. So let's talk a little bit about fortification. So, in a perfect world, we would all be eating a nutrient-dense diet. We would have no need for fortification. What is your stance on fortification? Is there any role for fortification in the modern world, in the modern diet? And if so, what might that be?
Well, I think there is, and again, it's one of those conversations where you often have a black and white discussion where you shouldn't have one. It's some cases are so acute that fortification is really needed to just to deal with existing human misery. It's a very powerful tool. It becomes more of a problem when it's becoming a paradigm, right? And so you mentioned before nixtamalization, and Mark Schatzer, in one of his books, I don't remember which, I think it's one of his latest books, The End of Craving, I think it's in this one, he comes up with this interesting comparison between the United States and the north of Italy. So both regions in the early 20th century were hit by pellagra, so a niacin deficiency. And that's because they were based, so the southern states in the US were very much, the diets were very much based on corn because that was the cheaper option. And in Italy, you had polenta, which is again a corn-derived product, and very little otherwise nutritious foods because they were just not affordable. And then, so what Schatzker is saying is that when Joseph Goldberger, made the link between pellagra and the diet, because before that they thought it was an infection or it was an infectious disease. He made a link with the diet and actually opened the way towards the discovery later of niacin. Because of that discovery, the US government, at some point in time, I think it was during the 1940s, started to fortify certain staples like flour and so on with niacin, among other nutrients, like including also iron and a couple of others. And then they managed to solve the problem. And so the fortification was extremely useful and helpful in eradicating pellagra, which was a devastating disease. It's a horrible disease. But Italy had another trajectory. So what happened in Italy is that the population also solved pellagra, but not through fortification, but because these people started to eat more rabbits, which were easy to keep, and they brought in a lot of nutrients. And I think there's also a point being made about wine consumption, because the unfiltered wine of that time was still containing yeast. There was a push to have more bread consumption rather than corn, and that solved the crisis as well. So what Schatzker then concludes from that contrast is that in the United States, a paradigm was installed where fortification became the fixing of the problem. So you fix the problem through fortification, and you maintain the idea that food is problematic. Okay, so it's something you need to fix by filling in the holes, and you fortify. And that idea, that concept, that paradigm, eventually ends up with ultra processed foods, because that's how you look at it. That's what, again, Kellogg's cornflakes is doing. It's a very poor basis for nutrition, but then you fortify it. You solve the problem by fortification. The Italian philosophy is that food is actually the solution, because you just have to bring in the foods that are doing the proper job. Now, so on the longer term, you may create those different perspectives on what diet actually means for people, and that's easily said, of course. I mean, and maybe it has that kind of, you know, foodie overtone and connotation, but I think there's some truth in it. So it's you cannot just install a new food culture and fix everything like from overnight. But what the nourishment table is trying to do is exactly that. You know, it's trying to put the focus on those nourishing foods that are maybe affordable and not too expensive, and you can come up with certain lists of such products and help you stay away and get you out of that left orange zone that is less robust. You know, it's a bit what the Italians have been doing in the early 20th century.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that makes sense to me, and again, I appreciate the nuance. It's like we can't just wave a magic wand and ensure that everybody is eating a nutrient-dense diet, because, of course, there are economic and geopolitical considerations, and people who are living well below the poverty
Yeah.
line in various parts of the world just don't have access to the amount of nutrient-dense calories that they need. So that does make sense to me. I'm curious now, just shifting gears a little bit, like how the Nourishment Table has been received in the academic community, and what you think the biggest obstacles are to shifting the conversation more in that direction from the current paradigm that we seem to be stuck in. Like that seems to me that we just continually get more and more of the same misguided scales. The dietary guidelines were just recently reevaluated. We had a big opportunity there for a shift. There were a lot of people advocating for that shift, but business as usual seems to just continue. So what do you think the major obstacles are there? And then again, like, what have you seen so far since you published the Nourishment Table?
Yeah, well, it's a very young publication, so the impact is minimal. It's also not we can't say it's a leading scientific journal in the top tier of the journals. So that also prevents, or limits its exposure. But it's just difficult to enter the dominant discourse within academia when we talk about nutrition. So that space is taken up by the leading paradigm, right? And that still is the one that is referring to healthy diets, and then healthy diets essentially mean whole grains and low fat, or if there's fat, it must be from plant oils, and stay away from red meat and substitute all your protein and try to get it based on beans. And so those very rigid ideas, and then I'm not saying they're all necessarily problematic, but they're certainly not valid for everyone, and it's just not working. And that's the main reason why we also started this exercise. So what we're seeing is now that we're having this dietary guidelines that are basically just having the same stories and just ramping it up essentially, starting in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and since we haven't seen any improvement. Year by year, metabolic syndrome and diabetes, they just increase. So even if the guidelines would be okay, there's something wrong in the policies. It's not working, and at some point you just would have. It's just not sustainable anymore, because the public health costs will be so massive that it will just not be. We won't be able anymore just to neglect it. You see the first cracks in the system, right? You mentioned the pushback against. Within the United States. So the cracks are appearing, and I think it is about we're about to reach the moment, I think, where new models will start to take over, and it will probably work through more bottom-up systems, and you see that already appearing, where communities that are adopting specific diets, and then they talk to each other, and people are getting healthier. And in many cases, if you look at those communities, whether they are low carb or ancestral health or whole food or any of those movements, they are essentially very compatible with the nourishment table. So the nourishment table is not revolutionary. It's actually the advice that my grandparents would have given me if I would just ask them what to eat. It's not rocket science. The revolutionary side of it, I think, is just that it tries to break with the current
The consensus
census
paradigm.
paradigm. Indeed, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, my very non-scientific, far less informed way of a version of the nourishment table many years ago. The advice that I used to give to my patients and in my blog posts was eat real food, and then eat real food, including animals. Was I added that on because you could of course eat just plants and be eating real food, but eat real food, including animals. That was my my clinician's version of the nourishment table.
Right.
And if we could maybe summarize the conversation here in a practical way for people, like if they're, someone's listening to this and they're thinking about how they're going to plan their meals for the week, what would you say as just the shorthand version that, when they're at the grocery store, when they're thinking about meal planning, what's the most practical way of applying this?
Yeah, well, it's so the problem is the real food kind of statement is actually quite good. We just cannot use that in the academic literature because that wouldn't be accepted. Because
Yeah,
what
of
does
course
real
not.
mean? Real as a construct, it's not an easy word, but people do know what it means. Pragmatically, people will understand what it means. So I think at the practical level, you can just use that real food, and it implies that you go for those foods that are known to be nutritious and nourishing, right? And that's why we insist on nourishment and not on healthiness, because healthiness has been co-opted. It doesn't mean anything. You can go to a person and ask, "Are you healthy?" How do you even begin to answer that? What it usually means is that you don't have a metabolic condition that you're aware of. But since that, what is it? Around 90% of the people with prediabetes don't even know they have prediabetes. What does that even mean? And nourishment, on the other hand, is something that is more real, more tangible. It means that you feel satiety. It means that you have these connotations of commensality as well. It's more than biological satisfaction. It's richer. It's the deeper satiety level that you kind of obtain through nourishment, and then you obtain that with certain foods, and people will quickly find out what it means if they stay away from those branded boxes with lots of ingredients and focus on the primary products that you get in the supermarket. And fair enough, some cooking skills may be needed, uh, but you can also, you don't have to be a chef, right? And it's not that you need to have an ocean of time to prepare all those meals. There are solutions to use simple foods. You can think of, if you go in a supermarket, don't buy the fruity yogurt with added starches and lots of sugar. Just buy the plain yogurt. If you want, you can add a drop of honey if it's too sour.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Just go down that direction, and very quickly, I think people will, and that's documented by so many case studies. People rediscover what it means to be nourished. It's a much more positive angle than the negative angle of healthy diets. Healthy in a way, what the word means nowadays is almost coming from a negative point of view. It's not the disease, right? That's healthy. Embrace embrace
Yeah,
foods, and include processed foods, like canned sardines or whole grain bread. That is, not the industrial type of bread. Have a piece of meat, have a piece of fish, have an omelette. No, an omelette is very easy to make, and it's very nourishing. Full fat dairy.
yeah. I mean, I think you don't need to be incredibly rigid about this. I've talked about the 80-20 rule or the 90-10 rule, or your exact proportion may vary depending on your health status and your goals. But if you aim for meeting these principles 80 to 90% of the time, you're probably going to get the majority of the benefit. Whereas if you aim for it 100% of the time and that's not stressful and it doesn't uproot your life in any way, that's fine. But if it means you're not going out to dinner with friends because you don't absolutely never want to have any seed oil at all,
Right.
there's a social cost to that, right? And we know that socializing is a very it contributes to our well-being in a lot of ways. And so if you cut that out of your life completely in the name of being healthy, or even well nourished, then there's no right or wrong here, but you have to consider the impact of that on our overall health. And that's something I've usually, I try to talk to my patients about, because I have, some highly motivated folks in my audience who, want to do the best for their health, but it's good to broaden the conversation that there's more to health than food
Right.
too.
Yeah.
That's a whole nother topic.
And there's a whole field of research that is looking into the effects, of eating together, and we've kind of lost that a lot. The eating behavior is pretty much now families come home and they eat at different times in the evening, and the one just drops something in the microwave and someone else. So this disconnect is actually very harmful for the entire nourishment potential, because if you eat together, you also take into account, you kind of behave differently, you eat differently, you eat in a different manner that is usually beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very often underestimated. And that only happens if you see indeed food just as nutrients. If you're the nutritionism perspective just tells you basically food that's an accumulation of nutrients, but it's so much more than that. And you cannot just neglect it. It comes with a price. Now, that said, of course, and we do know that some people have metabolic conditions and they have to narrow down that flexibility. And that's unfortunate. Some people will react badly to certain plants, or some people will react badly to certain degrees of carbohydrates. That also plays, of course. I mean, I'm not saying that we can have maximum flexibility for everyone. That would be ideal. But for many people, obsessing over food choices, I think one of the key messages would also be relax a bit, right? Don't see it as a religion.
Yes, I agree. So last question for you. Hopefully it's a fun one. If you were looking ahead 5 years and I were to give you a blank check and fund any research question that you wanted to answer, what would that be?
I think we need to know more about the mechanisms behind the overeating phenomena. So why are we overeating? Why is that happening? It has to do, I think, with the fact that you get, through ultra processed foods, you get fake information, because you have kind of fake foods bringing you fake information, and then there's just mismatch with what the body expects. And then the appestat that is normally very tightly regulating almost to perfection what we eat, the accuracy has been calculated. It's less than 1%. It's amazing how much precise the body actually can balance calories in, calories out, just because of the hormones and the signals. And something is going on there, and we just don't know enough about it. So I think a priority should be finding out the exact mechanism behind the distortion of our epistatic control, which would then be the basis for a proper evaluation of ultra processed foods and the NOVA system. What is actually driving that? We need more sophistication in that analysis, and that will require expensive research, I think. So Kevin Hall was going down that way, but I've seen that he unfortunately had run into trouble. But that, I think, would be a very interesting avenue for further research.
Yeah, I agree. That would be incredible to have that result, and we'll work on the blank check for you. see what we can do. All right, Frederic, thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. I know my audience is really going to appreciate this. Where can people follow you and learn more about your work? I follow you on X. That's how I get most of my updates from you. But what are the best ways for people to do that?
I think mostly on X, unless, of course, they have access to scientific publications, but that's not to be taken for granted. But on X, you can find me. I do have profiles on other social media platforms, but I don't use them very often. So if you want to have the latest things, it's on X. I also have a website called Aleph 2020. That's ALEPH 2020, where I'm trying to collect information and the latest. So it's an evolving website. It's a source of information on a specific topic of animal source foods, but it goes also beyond that, and it talks about sustainability and nutrition and ethics. So that's a place where you can also find evolving thoughts, and that's, I think, the most easy places to kind of follow what I'm doing.
Okay, well, thank you again, and thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you next time. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresserlac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.